The story of Broadmoor did not begin with bricks and iron gates. It began with a question that troubled the British legal system for over a century. What should be done with those who committed terrible crimes, yet are not of sound mind? This question first forced itself into the courts at the dawn of the 19th century, and its answers would slowly shape the institutions that followed. The French Revolutionary Wars left deep and lasting scars on the young men who fought them. Many returned home bearing more than physical wounds. They carried psychological trauma that at the time had no name and no treatment. One such man was James Hadfield. Hadfield had left London a healthy family man working in the silver trade. He returned from war severely injured, his mind visibly altered. Although his body healed, his mind was in turmoil, and he became consumed by religious delusion. He came to believe that his own sacrificial death, modelled on Christ's crucifixion, would bring about the second coming and the day of judgment. To achieve this, Hadfield conspired with Bannister Truelock to ensure his own execution by committing an act of treason. On the evening of the 15th of May 1800, King George III attended a performance at the Theatre Royal, Drury Lane. As the national anthem played and the audience stood, shots rang out. Bullets passed close to the king's head, but he was unharmed. The assassin, James Hadfield, had leapt onto the seating, aimed his pistols, and fired before being swiftly restrained and taken into custody. Hadfield was charged with high treason, a crime punishable by death. His defence was led by Thomas Erskine, the most formidable barrister of his age. Hadfield pleaded insanity, but under English law at the time, insanity meant total incapacity. The defendant had to be utterly unaware of their actions or their consequences. Hadfield's case complicated matters. He had planned the attack carefully, which suggested awareness, yet medical testimony clearly demonstrated severe mental disturbance. Erskine argued for the revolutionary concept of partial insanity, recognizing that a person could suffer delusions while otherwise appearing rational. The court was thrown into confusion. The jury could not reach a straightforward conclusion, and the judge ultimately halted proceedings. Hadfield was found not guilty, but with a crucial qualification. The judge declared that while the verdict was clearly an acquittal, the prisoner, for his own sake and for the sake of society at large, must not be discharged. This single sentence would change British legal history. Hadfield was placed in Bethlem. In response to the Hadfield case, Parliament hastily passed the Criminal Lunatics Act of 1800, allowing for the indefinite detention of defendants acquitted on grounds of insanity to be held until His Majesty's pleasure be known. Hadfield would spend the remainder of his life confined to Bethlem Royal Hospital, where he died of tuberculosis in 1841. For the first time, the state formally acknowledged that some individuals were both not guilty and too dangerous to release. More than 40 years later, another case would cement this uneasy balance between justice and mental illness. In 1843, a Scottish woodturner named Daniel Macnaghten, suffering from paranoid delusions, shot and killed Edward Drummond, the private secretary of the Prime Minister, Sir Robert Peel. Macnaghten was acquitted on grounds of insanity and committed to Bethlem. Public outrage over the verdict forced the House of Lords to demand legal clarity. The result was the Macnaghten rules, which defined insanity in English law. Under these rules, a defendant would not be held responsible if Due to a disease of the mind, they did not understand the nature and quality of their act, or did not know what they were doing was wrong. The test focused narrowly on intellectual understanding, not emotion, impulse, or moral compulsion. Nearly 20 years after the rules were established, Macnaghten himself would be transferred to Broadmoor. The institution, born from the very questions his case had reignited. Broadmoor was not simply a prison, nor a hospital in the traditional sense. James Hadfield's case had created a legal mechanism for detaining the criminally insane, but it offered no practical solution for where or how they should be held. As more defendants were acquitted on grounds of insanity, the system began to strain under the weight of its own unintended consequences. Madhouses, as they were commonly known, were few and scattered. Of these, Bethlem Royal Hospital, wildly known as Bedlam, bore the greatest burden. Already notorious for overcrowding, poor conditions, and a grim public reputation, Bethlem, or Bedlam, now faced a new and growing category of patient. Individuals who were not merely ill, but who had committed serious crimes. Additional wings for the criminally insane were constructed, but these offered only temporary relief. Funding was limited, conditions remained under scrutiny, and Bethlem's name continued to provoke public unease. It was a hospital haunted by its past and struggling to meet the demands of its future. In 1815, a newly rebuilt Bethlem opened at St George's Fields, south of the Thames. Modern by the standards of its day, it included purpose-designed accommodation for criminal lunatics. For a time it helped, but it was not enough. As the decades passed, Bethlem's new wings filled rapidly. Across Britain, short-term asylums appeared in quick succession. They were popping up here, there, and everywhere, hastily purposed to absorb overflow. By the late 1850s, pressure was mounting throughout the system. Prisons were ill-equipped to manage inmates whose crimes were inseparable from mental illness. Ordinary county asylums struggled to contain offenders who posed a clear danger to the public. For years, officials had warned of impending failure. Judges, prison governors, medical superintendents, and the lunacy commissioners all reached the same conclusion. The existing arrangements were no longer sustainable. Something had to change. In 1860, Parliament acted. The Criminal Lunatics Act of 1860, passed with royal assent from Queen Victoria, authorised the creation of an entirely new kind of institution, a state-run asylum specifically designed for criminally insane offenders and placed directly under the authority of the Home Office. This was a decisive shift. Responsibility for criminal lunatics would no longer be scattered across hospitals and prisons. It would be centralised, controlled, and overseen by the state itself. What was now required was land. On the Berkshire heath near Crowthorne, a remote and elevated site was chosen. High on a ridge, deep within the surrounding woodland, the location was deliberately isolated, distant from towns, difficult to reach, and commanding in its position. It was a place selected not only to contain danger, but to symbolise authority. Here, the construction of Broadmoor began. Responsibility for the design fell to Sir Joshua Jebb, the Home Office's Surveyor General of Prisons and Britain's foremost authority on secure institutional architecture. Jebb approached the project with principles refined through years of prison design. Broadmoor would not merely house patients, it would manage them. Construction commenced in 1860. Much of the labour was supplied by convicts transported under guard to the site. Day after day they quarried stone, hauled brick, and raised walls on the exposed heathland. Slowly the asylum took shape. After 3 years of sustained effort, the buildings were sufficiently complete to begin receiving patients, and in 1863 Broadmoor rose above the tree line, vast, imposing, and unmistakably purposeful. It was the first institution in Britain built expressively for those deemed both criminal and insane. A new chapter had begun. The task of overseeing this unprecedented establishment fell to its first medical superintendent, Dr. John Meyer, unanimously appointed in January 1862. Meyer was born in 1814 at Norwood near London. He became a physician with an impressive and international record after studying medicine in Heidelberg and graduating in 1836. He eventually left England for Australia and was appointed superintendent of the hospital and convict lunatic asylum in New Norfolk in Tasmania. During the Crimean War, Meyer left Tasmania to do his part and was placed in charge of the civil hospital in Smyrna. And in 1858 he returned to England to become chief resident physician at the Surrey County Asylum. As Broadmoor neared completion, Meyer was asked to assess the new institution and advise on what should be added or altered. His view was straightforward, if optimistic. Criminal asylums, he believed, should be run pretty much like any other asylum. Reality, however, had other ideas. Years later, while carrying out his duties, Dr. Meyer was viciously attacked by a patient in the asylum chapel with a large stone tied inside a handkerchief. Though he survived the assault, the injuries he suffered saw his decline in his health over the last few years at the hospital and ultimately brought about his untimely death in 1871. It was, unfortunately, a grim reminder of Broadmoor's challenges. Dr. William Orange joined John Meyer at Broadmoor in 1862 as Deputy Medical Superintendent. He was by his side for 9 years and later succeeded him in his role. His work at the institution earned him a worldwide reputation as a leading authority on the treatment of criminal lunatics. As medical advisor to the Home Office, Orange was responsible for assessing the sanity of prisoners condemned to death and became involved in several highly controversial cases, situations where his opinions could quite literally decide life or death. Like Meyer before him, Orange also experienced the occupational hazards of working at Broadmoor. In 1882, he was the target of an attempted murder by a patient, the Reverend H. J. Dowdwell. Although he survived the attack, Orange never fully recovered. In 1886, he chose to retire from active duty, though he continued to serve on Broadmoor's Board of Council, contributing to the institution's supervision and direction. The careers of Meyer and Orange is briefly summarised here. They were far more complex and demanding than any short account can fully convey. Between them, they shaped Broadmoor's early years, years defined by ambition, uncertainty, and constant tension between care and control. Broadmoor was never intended to be merely a hospital, nor was it quite a prison. It was something new, an institution born of legal necessity, public fear, and Victorian faith in order. And its true legacy was only just beginning. The first wing constructed at Broadmoor was not for men. Separated from the rest of the site by its own enclosing wall and surrounded by independent grounds, the initial building was designated entirely for women. As a result, Broadmoor's first patients were female. On Wednesday, the 27th of May, 1863, 8 women were transferred to the asylum. Their journey began at Waterloo Station, where they boarded a train bound for Wokingham. Upon arrival, they disembarked alongside their accompanying paperwork and were met by horse-drawn Broadmoor coaches waiting at the platform. From there they travelled the final 5 miles through the Berkshire countryside to the asylum itself. Once inside, they were formally admitted. Their names, details, and diagnoses were entered into Broadmoor's first admissions register, a quiet administrative act marking the institution's true opening. The first name ever written into Broadmoor's admissions register was Mary Ann Parr. She was 35 years old and a labourer from Nottingham. She had been convicted of suffocating her illegitimate newborn child. Mary's story, like many that would follow, did not begin at Broadmoor. When she was 25, Mary was found guilty at Nottingham of killing her baby. At first, the court sentenced her to transportation, the standard punishment of the time, but her fate changed after a medical examination. Doctors declared her mentally unfit, and her sentence was commuted to detention at Her Majesty's pleasure. She was sent to Bethlem Royal Hospital. Mary would remain there for 10 years before being transferred to Broadmoor when the new institution opened. She would spend the rest of her life behind its walls, 37 years in total, dying there in 1900, aged 71. Her arrival at Broadmoor was recorded in careful detail. Her name, age, place of birth, and offence were entered into the register. She was examined by a doctor, her physical and mental condition assessed, and notes were written. Notes that would follow her for decades, added to year after year. From the beginning, Mary was described as being in poor physical health and of weak intellect, language that reflected both her condition and limited medical understanding of the time. Treatment at Broadmoor followed the principles of Victorian asylum care. Days were tightly structured. Patients rose early, exercised, and were expected to work if they were able. Women like Mary spent their time doing laundry or cleaning and other domestic labour that kept the institution running. The meals were simple and plain. Meat was rare. Bread, porridge, and vegetables formed the bulk of the diet. Fresh air was considered essential to recovery, and patients spent long hours outdoors, walking the grounds or working in the open air. For Mary and the 7 other women who arrived with her, many of them shaped by poverty, instability, and hardship, Broadmoor offered something unfamiliar: regular meals, structure, shelter, and freedom from the constant anxiety of survival. But this security came at a terrible cost. Every woman in that first group had arrived there because a life had been taken or irreversibly damaged. All were carrying the weight of acts that Victorian society could neither forgive nor fully understand. The first building constructed at Broadmoor was the women's ward. In its first 9 months, the institution admitted only female patients. All available beds were occupied during this period. The wards were divided to accommodate the patients properly. This section was separated from the area being built for the male blocks. Beyond the walls of the female block, the sound of construction never stopped. The male convict labourers worked day after day on the men's wings, raising walls, laying stone, and expanding the asylum around the women already inside. Broadmoor was still being built even as it began to fill. From the very start, it was clear that Broadmoor was not a temporary solution. It was a place designed for long stays, for lost lives, and in many cases for those who would never leave. On a cold, wet Saturday morning on the 27th of February 1864, Broadmoor was, at last, complete. The timing was appropriate. Nothing about Broadmoor suggested it was ever meant to open on a sunny day. With the final blocks ready for use, the first male patients were transferred to the hospital. Most arrived from Bethlem Royal Hospital, where space had long since run out. Others were sent from Fisherton House Asylum, another institution struggling under the weight of cases it was never designed to hold. By the end of that year, the great experiment was fully underway. The original architectural plan had been ambitious: one block for the women and four for men, with space for 500 patients in total. In true Victorian fashion, this target would be reached, but not immediately. The full design was only realised in 1868, after years of expansion, adjustment, and the quiet acceptance that Broadmoor would always be fuller than anyone planned. Patients arrived from every corner of Britain and from every level of society. Some were illiterate labourers, others were well-educated professionals. A few came from families of influence and wealth, living proof that madness, unlike privilege, respected no social hierarchy whatsoever. And Broadmoor was a great leveller. Once the criminal courts became involved, the usual Victorian escape routes closed very quickly. Wealth could no longer buy a comfortable private asylum. Family connections could not arrange discreet care at home. Once sentenced, there was only one destination: Broadmoor. Money might still soften many things in Victorian England, but not this. In that respect, at least, the system was brutally fair. Broadmoor quickly developed a reputation for its extraordinary cast of characters. No two stories were quite the same. Some were tragic, some were terrifying, others were quietly heartbreaking. A few, with the benefit of hindsight, might even have been preventable. There were patients who improved and were eventually released, blinking back into the outside world after years behind the walls. Others became so accustomed to life inside Broadmoor that they feared leaving it, because here at least life was predictable, structured, and safe. And then there were those who were never expected to go anywhere at all. In such cases, the Home Office agreed that for the safety of both the patient and the public, indefinite detention was the only realistic option. Broadmoor was not simply a place of treatment, it was a place of containment. Victorian notoriety occasionally followed some patients through the gates, bringing with it whispers, rumours, and the occasional newspaper headline. One name in particular would echo far beyond Broadmoor's walls: Richard Dadd. Richard Dadd was no ordinary patient. He was a highly talented and well-educated artist. from a respectable middle-class family with a promising career and influential patrons. Richard Dadd was born on the 1st of August 1817 into a well-to-do family in Kent. He was the fourth of 7 children, growing up in circumstances that offered comfort, education and opportunity. After the death of his father's second wife, the family moved to London. When Richard was around 17 years old, his talent was already clear, and soon after he enrolled at the Royal Academy schools, training formally as an artist and quickly attracting attention. Dad showed a particular gift for fairy painting, a genre that allowed imagination to run well ahead of reality. His works were painted in heavy oils, packed with extraordinary detail, and filled with fantastical creatures sporting exaggerated expressions, tiny figures in lush otherworldly landscapes, each face seeming alive with its own private thoughts. They were paintings that invited close inspection and, in hindsight, perhaps revealed more than he intended. In July 1842, Dad set out on an extended tour of Europe and the Middle East with his patron, Sir Thomas Phillips. It was an ambitious journey and by all accounts an exhausting one. Europe gave way to the Middle East, where the heat was relentless and the conditions were harsh. By the time they reached Egypt and travelled along the Nile by boat, Dad was suffering from intense headaches and what was described at the time as sunstroke. His mental health deteriorated rapidly. As they continued their travels, Dad became increasingly paranoid, convinced that he was being followed and watched. The first signs of Richard Dadd's mental decline appear in his letters home. Calm and almost casual, they reveal a man aware that his mind was changing, yet trying to rationalize it. He described feeling detached from reality, troubled by unfamiliar moods and thoughts, but showed little alarm. Instead, he seemed quietly curious about his own unravelling. His behaviour grew erratic and threatening, and it's said that while in Rome he felt a powerful urge to attack the Pope during a public appearance, an idea that thankfully remained only an idea. By the time the pair reached Paris in the spring of 1843, it was clear that exhaustion alone could no longer explain Dad's condition. By May 1843, when the travelling party reached Paris, the strain could no longer be ignored. Dad suffered what amounted to a near-complete mental collapse. His patron, Sir Thomas Phillips, deeply concerned, sent for a doctor to examine him. That was enough to send Dad into a panic. He fled, abandoning Phillips and returning to England alone. Phillips wrote to Richard's father, explaining to him what to expect when he saw his son. Back in London, Dad lived in Newman Street. He continued to work and survived largely on a diet of hard-boiled eggs and ale, which, while economical, was unlikely to improve his mental health. And just as tragically, some of his other brothers were also now showing signs of mental illness. Publicly, Richard's father insisted his son was perfectly well. Privately, the worried father knew there was a problem and had arranged for a medical examination. Despite warnings of Richard's unstable state of mind from the doctor, Richard's father, Robert Dadd, when asked by Richard, chose to join his son on a short trip to Cobham on August 28, 1843, with Richard promising to ease his father's worries. Dad had become convinced that his father was plotting to take away his freedom. In his mind, decisive action was required. Richard Dadd was no fool. Before meeting his father, he planned his escape, ensuring that whatever came next, he would not be taken easily. On that day, they travelled together, had dinner at a nearby inn, and then took a walk through the countryside. And at around 11 o'clock that night, near a chalk pit known as Paddock Hole, Richard attacked his father with a knife and a razor and killed him because he believed him to be the devil in disguise. He left immediately, travelling to Dover, where he boarded a ship to Calais, and 2 days later the blood-covered body of Robert Dadd was discovered. When police went to search Richard's rooms in London, they found disturbing drawings and images of his friends with their throats cut. In Paris, Dadd was arrested after attempting to cut another man's throat. Following his arrest, Dadd admitted to the French police that he had already taken his father's life in England. When he was searched, they found a piece of paper with a list of names written on it. His father's name was at the top. This was said to be a list of people Dadd was going to kill. He was detained in a French asylum. Meanwhile, back in England, steps were being taken to bring Dadd back to the country. And in July 1844, a dishevelled-looking Dadd was returned. He was declared criminally insane and ordered to be removed to a place of permanent safety without standing trial. Dadd was first confined at Bethlem Hospital on the 22nd of August 1844, before becoming one of Broadmoor's earliest and most famous residents. Even within the asylum, he continued to paint. The works he produced there are now considered masterpieces of Victorian art, a reminder that genius and madness have always been uncomfortable neighbours. On the 23rd of July 1864, 47-year-old Dadd made the trip with 5 other men to Broadmoor. He continued to paint works such as the Fairy Feller's Masterstroke, which would secure his reputation long after his death. Though his mind remained fractured, his artistic talent never deserted him. His demons resided in his head and were constant companions. Richard Dadd died at Broadmoor of tuberculosis on the 7th of January 1886. It was quiet and little was said. Dadd's work gained more recognition in the 1970s. Interestingly, one of his pieces were found on the TV show Antiques Roadshow in the 1980s, and it now hangs in the British Museum. He left behind a legacy that unsettles and fascinates in equal measure, a reminder that within Broadmoor's walls lived not monsters, but profoundly damaged human beings, some of whom were capable of extraordinary creation even as their lives unravelled. Broadmoor was built to contain danger. It also unintentionally preserved genius. Another well-known inmate was Edward Oxford, the young man who attempted to assassinate Queen Victoria in 1840. Oxford came from a modest but educated background and was found not guilty by reason of insanity. His case caused public outrage, but instead of the gallows, he was confined to Bethlem and later transferred to Broadmoor. In time, he became a model patient, learning trades and eventually being released and sent abroad, an outcome that did little to calm public fears at the time. Edward Oxford was born in Birmingham on the 9th of April 1822, the third of 7 children to Edward Sr., a goldsmith, and Hannah Oxford. Hannah claimed her husband was an alcoholic and violent in the home. She moved out, taking the children with her, and not long after she had left Edward Sr., he passed away. Edward was often boarded out to school while his mother worked, but he seemed fine with the arrangement, as his extended family always looked out for each other, and he and his mother were very close. After finishing school, Edward went to work in London pubs, first working for his aunt at her pub. He continued to stay living with his mother and his siblings. He was a quiet boy who enjoyed spending time alone reading. after some unsuccessful jobs for reasons that were never fully clear, although it was said at trial that he was fired for inappropriate giggling fits that arrived without warning. He was left unemployed in early May 1840 without having another job to go to. This was an early sign that his life was about to change dramatically. On the evening of the 10th of June 1840, while his mother was away, Oxford positioned himself on a footpath at Constitution Hill near Buckingham Palace, and at around 6 o'clock the young pregnant Queen Victoria, accompanied by Prince Albert, emerged from the palace in an open carriage, and as the carriage drew level with Oxford, he fired 2 shots from 2 separate pistols in the Queen's direction. Members of the public immediately seized and disarmed him. Oxford appeared remarkably unfazed by events, loudly declaring, "It was me, I did it." Confusion followed. No bullets were ever recovered, and Oxford later claimed that the pistols contained only gunpowder. Whether the Queen's life had truly been in danger remained inconveniently unclear, and I forgot to mention that the Queen didn't get harmed in any way. Oxford was arrested and charged with treason. A search of his lodgings uncovered a handwritten constitution for a fictional military organisation called Young England. Oxford appeared to be its only actual member. Though he had invented a full hierarchy of officers, members, according to the document, were to be armed with a brace of pistols, a sword, a rifle, and a dagger. An ambitious loadout for an army of one. By now, Oxford was no longer living his own life so much as performing it, observing himself from a distance, casting himself as both hero and narrator. Reality had slipped into the third person. This discovery, combined with witness statements describing long-standing signs of instability, formed the backbone of his defence at a highly publicised trial. It was top doctors like Dr. John Connolly, Dr. Thomas Hodgkin, and Dr. William Chown who helped decide Oxford was incapable of self-control. Oxford was ultimately found not guilty by reason of insanity, a verdict that did little to calm public opinion but spared him the gallows. Oxford was confined at Bethlem Hospital, where he remained for over 20 years before being transferred to Broadmoor. There he became something of a model patient. He read extensively. He learned French, German, and Italian, helped around the hospital, took up painting, and quietly acquired a range of practical skills, an unexpectedly productive outcome for a would-be regicide. Oxford worked hard at Broadmoor. He was also very well behaved and showed signs of intelligence. Then in November 1864, Sir William Hayter, chair of Broadmoor's Council of Supervision, wrote to Home Secretary Sir George Grey stating his belief that Oxford was sane. He was supported by Charles Hood, a council member who had previously treated Oxford at Bethlem. Grey ignored the request. In September 1867, the new Home Secretary, Gathorne Hardy, looked again at the request, and an offer was made. Oxford was offered release on one condition. He must leave the United Kingdom and never return. He agreed without hesitation. A passage to Australia was arranged, where he settled into a respectable colonial life. He later became a church warden, a writer, married and wrote a book, and later lived out his remaining years far from Buckingham Palace. Edward Oxford died in 1900, remembered for what he nearly did. So as we can see, Broadmoor did not confine only the forgotten and the poor. It also held those whose crimes had horrified polite society, precisely because they came from places they preferred not to look too closely at. One of the most notorious was Christiana Edmunds.
a well-educated, financially comfortable woman from Brighton who would enter history under the memorable and deeply unsettling title of the Chocolate Cream Killer. Christiana Edmunds was the eldest child of William Edmunds, a local architect, and Anne Christiana, the daughter of a military major, born in 1829 in the seaside town of Margate. Respectable, comfortable, and thoroughly Victorian, at least on the surface. Trouble arrived early when Christiana was 14. Her father went mad, as the phrase was delicately put, and was quietly sent into private care, the preferred solution when one could afford discretion. He died 4 years later. Her younger brother, Arthur, was born with learning difficulties and grew into a young man prone to violent rages. He spent the final years of his short life in Earlswood Asylum, dying there at just 26. Christiana's sister Louisa feared no better. After working as a governess, she suffered from what doctors labelled hysteria, a diagnosis that explained everything and nothing, and died in her 30s after throwing herself from a window. It was, to put it mildly, not an encouraging family history. But one member of the family did manage to walk away from the curse, her sister Mary, who married a clergyman and moved to Chichester. By the mid-1860s, Christiana and her widowed mother relocated to Brighton, a town famous for its sea air and social life, and the comforting belief that fresh breezes could cure almost anything. Christiana was now middle-aged, financially independent, and profoundly bored, which, as Broadmoor's records would later suggest, is never a promising combination. In 1869, Christiana met Dr. Charles Beard, a local physician who lived opposite Christiana's home. She had become ill and decided, as the doctor was close by, to go to him. Some kind of close relationship developed, though its exact nature remains unclear. We do not know it wasn't physical and seems to have developed through letter writing. But what is clear is that Christiana believed herself deeply attached. Dr. Beard, who was married, did not share this belief. He'd been married for 10 years and the couple had 4 children, one being a newborn. He eventually asked her to stop writing to him around the summer of 1869, something he should have stopped as soon as it started instead of replying to them. She did not. Instead, one day in September 1870, Christiana, who had often visited the Beard household, called in to see Mrs. Beard, and bringing with her a box of chocolate creams as a gesture of goodwill. It was an unfortunate choice. Later that same day, Mrs. Beard became violently ill after eating some of the chocolates. Dr. Beard immediately suspected Christiana and accused her of poisoning his wife. Christiana naturally denied everything, explaining that she herself had felt unwell after eating similar chocolates, which she presented as proof of her innocence rather than an alarming coincidence. Faced with denial, awkwardness, and an absence of clear evidence, Dr. Beard backed down and chose not to involve the police. The episode was quietly smoothed over, or so he hoped. Christiana, however, did not take the hint. She continued to pester the Beard family until in January 1871 she was issued with a firm and unmistakable instruction she was never to return to the Beard household again. While Beard was ignoring letters from Christiana that she bombarded him with, Brighton's troubles were only just beginning. Over the following months, the town experienced a disturbing rise in sudden, unexplained illnesses, all connected, though not yet officially, to the consumption of chocolate. Then in June 1871, a visitor named Charles Miller, holidaying Brighton with his brother and his family, purchased chocolate creams from J. G. Maynard's sweet shop.
He ate several himself and gave one to his 4-year-old nephew, Sidney Barker. Both became violently ill. Miller survived. Little Sidney did not. At the coroner's inquest, chemical testing revealed strychnine in the chocolates sold by Maynard. And curiously, Christiana Edmunds appeared as a witness, claiming that she too had eaten chocolates from the same shop and had fallen ill. Despite the evidence, there was no proof of deliberate poisoning. Sidney's death was ruled accidental, and the shopkeeper, John Maynard, was cleared. He destroyed his entire stock, though his reputation, like his chocolates, was left in a questionable state. Christiana thought, which was her intention, that this would vindicate her with Dr. Beard, but her constant pestering of him had become too much, and he decided to depart for a new life in Scotland with his family. This, it would seem, would send Christiana into a more downward spiral. Sidney Barker's father began receiving anonymous letters urging him to sue the confectioner. The letters hinted darkly that the truth had not yet emerged and that foul play was involved, and urged him to talk with the woman who had given evidence at the inquest. It would later be discovered that Christiana had sent those letters. Meanwhile, the poisonings continued, suggesting that Brighton's chocolate problem was not going away. There was a sense of fear through the streets of the town. People were still getting sick, and the police were worried. Who was doing this? The police eventually put an advertisement in the local newspaper offering a reward for any information leading to the arrest of the poisoner. Christiana's obsession caused her to devise another plan, and on the 8th of August she left Brighton to spend 2 days in Margate, apparently attending to some family business. Then she caught the train to London. Before returning to Brighton from Victoria on Thursday the 10th of August 1871, she posted 6 parcels containing poisoned plum cake and fruits, addressed to prominent members of the Brighton Society, including Mrs. Beard, and to deflect attention away from herself, she sent one addressed to herself. And on the 10th of August 1871, they each received those parcels by courier. A plum cake arrived at the Beard household. This time caution prevailed. The maids inspected it, tasted it, and quickly decided that something was very wrong indeed. Dr. Beard was informed at once, and this time the Beards' neighbours had also received a mystery parcel. The police were called, and all those that had been sent a poisoned cake or fruits were visited, including Christiana, who acted shocked and scared for her own safety. Christiana once again wrote to Dr. Beard, going into detail about the whole terrible scene with the cake, and made reference to the inquest about the young boy. Dr. Beard, now entirely out of patience, took his suspicions to the police. He gave them all of the letters she had continued to write to him, some open, some not. The police agreed her behaviour was odd, and wrote to her about the young boy who had passed away. She replied, and with this reply they analysed her handwriting. It was a match to the writing on the poisoned parcels and the anonymous letters sent to Mr. Barker. They also discovered that she had been on the same train that the poisoned parcels travelled on when she returned to Brighton. The motive, it would seem, was her obsession with Dr. Beard and a deep desire to get Mrs. Beard out of the way. By this point, Christiana had begun what can only be described with Victorian understatement as experiments. She acquired strychnine and set about testing it in preparation for another attempt to remove what she saw as a chief obstacle to her happiness. This was not a sudden impulse, but a methodical campaign. Throughout the spring and summer of 1871, different doses of poison were allegedly tried out, first on animals, and then, more alarmingly, on unsuspecting members of the public. Chocolates, cakes, and fruit were laced, distributed, and carefully observed. The results were noted. Adjustments were made. It was chemistry by obsession, conducted not in a laboratory, but in sweet shops and on Brighton's streets. To Christiana, this was not cruelty or madness, it was preparation, and she believed she was getting better at it. Sidney Barker's terrible death was the result of her experiments. She was arrested a week later and put on trial at the Old Bailey in January 1872. Initially charged with the attempted murder of Mrs. Beard, the charge was later amended to the murder of Sidney Barker. By most accounts, Christiana was disappointed by this. She had hoped for a more elaborate, scandal-filled trial, one involving dramatic revelations and the public unravelling of respectable lives. Reality, as it often does, proved less accommodating. At trial it emerged that Christiana had employed boys to buy sweets from Maynard's shop. She injected chocolates and cakes with strychnine and calmly returned them to the shelves. Others she left casually on tables and lethal traps for anyone with a sweet tooth. A chemist who supplied the strychnine knew Edwards as Mrs. Woods and confirmed supplying her with the strychnine at least 3 times. The defence immediately raised an insanity plea, supported by the Edmunds family's long history of mental illness. Several prominent medical authorities rose to testify in Christiana's defence. Dr. William Wood of Bethlehem argued that she met the central requirement of the Macnaghten rules. She was incapable of distinguishing right from wrong. Dr. Henry Maudsley went further, classifying her among the morally defective, individuals who were emotionally impaired, unable to grasp the harm they caused, or troublingly indifferent to it. Then came the most uncomfortable testimony of all. Christiana's mother took the stand and unfolded the family's long and painful history of mental illness. This was the one moment the carefully composed Christiana broke. As her mother exposed the family's private tragedies to a packed courtroom, Christiana cried out, "This is more than I can bear for a woman accused of poisoning strangers and killing a child." It was the raw public airing of family secrets, not the charges themselves, that proved hardest to endure. The jury was unconvinced. When the jury was asked to consider their verdict, they took an hour before they found Christiana Edmunds guilty of murder. They did not recommend mercy. Before the sentence was passed, Christiana was asked the customary question. Did she have anything to say? Oh, she did, and it was not an apology. Instead, she insisted that she should be tried on the original charge of attempting to murder Emily Beard, purely so she could explain the true nature of her relationship with Dr. Beard. "It is owing to the treatment I received in going to him," she declared, "that I have been brought to this dreadful business. I wish the jury had known the intimacy, his affection for me, and the way I have been treated." In her mind, this was not simply a trial about poisoned chocolates. It was unfinished drama. If she was to fall, she intended to take Dr. Beard with her, reputationally, if not legally. Unfortunately for her, the courtroom had moved on. The verdict was in, the moment had passed, and it was far too late for that. She then promptly claimed to be pregnant. A last-minute attempt at delay. A medical examination disproved this, and she was returned to her cell. The Home Office ordered a formal psychiatric assessment, and on the 23rd of January 1872, Dr. William Orange, Superintendent of Broadmoor, and Sir William Gull from Guy's Hospital, visited and concluded that Christiana was morally defective and unable to recognise that her actions were wrong. On this basis, the Home Secretary overturned the verdict. Christiana Edmunds was declared not guilty by reason of insanity. The public reaction was swift and furious. Many believed that her education and comfortable background had spared her from the gallows. Nonetheless, on the 5th of July 1872, she was transferred to Broadmoor Criminal Lunatic Asylum for indefinite detention. She was 43 years old. Christiana proved at times to be a difficult resident. She frequently antagonized other patients, hid contraband in her room, and caused no end of disruption on the wards. Yet she also settled into useful work, assisting with sewing and laundry. She was, by all accounts, an enthusiastic flirt, which I can believe, whenever male staff approached the women's wing, and particularly enjoyed the New Year dances attended by male medical officers. Christiana Edmunds remained at Broadmoor for the rest of her life. As she aged, her enthusiasm faded and she grew tired. When in her 70s, her health weakened and her eyesight diminished. She died there on the 19th of September 1907, aged 78. Even near the end, she retained a keen interest in her appearance. Her cause of death was recorded with typical Victorian brevity as senile decay, a chillingly ordinary ending for a woman whose crimes were anything but. Many accounts have chosen to romanticize Christiana Edmunds, the educated woman, the tragic lover, the misunderstood Victorian villainess with poisoned chocolates and a dramatic courtroom presence. But it is difficult to share the same sympathy. What often gets lost beneath the intrigue is the simple, brutal truth. A child died. A 4-year-old boy, Sidney Barker, lost his life because of her actions. This was not an abstract tragedy or a moral experiment gone wrong. It was real harm inflicted deliberately and repeatedly. The grief of Sidney's family really features in the story, overshadowed by courtroom drama and psychiatric debate. Christiana's case forces us to confront an uneasy question that Victorian society struggled with, and that still unsettles us today. When illness explains an act, does it lessen its weight? And at what point does sympathy for the offender begin to eclipse justice for the victim? For some, Christiana remains a figure of fascination. For others, she is a reminder that danger can wear respectability very convincingly. And that fascination should never erase the cost paid by those who had no part in the story, except to suffer its consequences. Thomas Haynes Cutbush. He was born in 1866 in Kennington, a district about 3 miles from Whitechapel. He came from a respectable middle-class Victorian family, a social class that was expected to produce lawyers, clerks, dependable dinner guests, not violent criminals. But his childhood was fractured early. His father abandoned the family when Thomas was about 2 years old. It's believed he emigrated to New Zealand and started again with a new wife. Thomas was left behind in England, an only child raised by his mother Kate and her unmarried sister Clara. Kate doted on him, perhaps a little bit too much. Both women were deeply religious, and it has been suggested they themselves suffered from neurological disorders. Whatever the truth, Thomas grew up in a household heavy on devotion and light on stability, a combination that really ends well. Adult life did not improve matters. Cutbush's first job ended almost immediately. His second ended more dramatically. He pushed his employer down a flight of stairs. After that, regular employment became something of a lost cause. He developed habits that seemed to become alarming to his neighbours. He was sleeping by day and apparently wandering Whitechapel by night, leaping over walls and obsessively reading medical textbooks. He became convinced someone was slowly poisoning him,
apparently a belief that would stay with him. By 1888, his behaviour grew worse. It had been claimed he had contracted syphilis, likely from prostitutes, and from that point his paranoia and aggression intensified. But his admission documents and his asylum records at Broadmoor make no mention of syphilis or any sexually transmitted disease. In fact, the record states the cause of his insanity was hereditary and, according to his Aunt Clara Hayne, over studying. He was briefly confined to an asylum in Lambeth, but only for a few days. He later claimed he was there for just a visit. In 1891, he was convicted after he had turned openly violent. Cutbush attacked two women, Florence Grace Johnson and Isabella Fraser Anderson, stabbing them in the buttocks on two separate occasions in broad daylight on a public road in Kennington. He was charged with malicious wounding. This time there was no escape. A medical board examined Cutbush while he was at Holloway and declared him psychotic and dangerous. He was found responsible for the attacks, but not in the way a conventional criminal would be. Instead, he was ordered to be confined at Her Majesty's pleasure. Cutbush was sent to Broadmoor Criminal Lunatic Asylum, where society could finally stop worrying about what he might do next, and where he joined the long list of men whose respectability dissolved completely once madness entered the room. Shortly after his admission, it became clear that Cutbush had not arrived at Broadmoor in a reflective or cooperative mood. On one occasion, he simply walked up to another patient and punched him hard in the face. No warning, no provocation, just an introduction. What followed did little to calm matters. Cutbush launched into a torrent of foul language, issuing vivid threats against staff and fellow patients alike. He declared he would rip them apart and hang them, and generally reorganize the asylum along the lines of his own imagination. It was not, as staff noted dryly, the language of rehabilitation. Even family visits were not safe. When Mrs. Cutbush attempted the familiar comfort of a kiss, her son responded by trying to bite her face off. He then turned his attention to verbally abusing both his mother and her sister, who had come along in support. For the Broadmoor staff, this early behaviour removed any lingering doubt. Cutbush was not merely unsettled, he was volatile, aggressive, and dangerous. Whatever hopes there had been for a quiet adjustment to asylum life were swiftly and loudly abandoned. He remained silently aggressive, neglected his hygiene, and went further into the depths of madness. And then, in February 1894, a newspaper article in the Sun regarding the serial killer named Jack the Ripper. Although his name wasn't mentioned, it was seemingly obvious who the article was about. It claimed this man, i.e. Cutbush, was responsible for the Jack the Ripper murders. The claim caused a brief stir. After all, Cutbush had prowled Whitechapel, suffered from paranoia, shown violent tendencies, and had a documented history of attacking women with a knife. On paper, it sounded ominously convincing. The authorities, however, were not impressed. Senior police officials, including Melville McNaughton of Scotland Yard, swiftly dismissed the accusation. They stated that Cutbush's known attacks did not match the brutality or pattern of the killings, and that there was no credible evidence linking him to the Whitechapel murders. It was because of this that Melville McNaughton prepared his confidential memorandum, in which he famously named his three suspects, M.J. Druitt, Michael Ostrog, and Kosminski. Cutbush remained where he already was, securely confined in Broadmoor, dangerous enough without being retrospectively promoted to history's most infamous serial killer. The Ripper mystery survived intact, and no matter what, Cutbush joined the long list of suspects. And so the newspapers pressed on.
The unknown serial killer, faceless, nameless, and endlessly profitable, would be hunted forever in print. As for Thomas Cutbush, he died in Broadmoor on the 5th of July 1903 of chronic kidney disease. William Giles's story is one of the quietest and most unsettling in Broadmoor's long history. He arrived in 1885, aged just 10 years old. He was one of the youngest, if not the youngest, ever admitted to Broadmoor, and one of the longest staying. His case file is still closed, and people only know William Giles from his entire life spent inside asylum walls. 77 years until his death, aged 87 in 1962. William was a local Berkshire boy. As far as records allow us to see, his crime was arson. He set fire to stacks of straw, oats and barley in a field in Buckinghamshire. To Victorian authorities, fire was no childish mischief. It was danger, disorder and fear rolled into one. William had severe learning disabilities and epilepsy, conditions poorly understood at the time and often treated with deep suspicion. When his case reached court, he was deemed unfit to enter a plea. Doctors and officials judged him a high risk of reoffending, and so, at the age when most children were learning to read or work in the fields, William Giles was sent to Broadmoor, and there he stayed. Broadmoor became his school, his workplace, his social world, and ultimately his home. He grew up there, he made friends there, he spent his entire working life within its routines, and when old age finally arrived, he remained, not as a patient in crisis, but as a pensioner of the institution. William Giles did not arrive at Broadmoor as a monster or a mastermind. He arrived as a child who frightened adults with fire and whom the system did not know how, or perhaps did not try, to help. When he died in 1962, Broadmoor had changed. Medicine had changed, and the world outside its walls had transformed beyond recognition. William Giles, however, had never seen most of it. For him, Broadmoor was not a sentence. It was a lifetime. After Giles's death, it was discussed in the House of Lords in 1962 by Lord Stoneham. Lord Newton replied, "The man whom the noble lord referred, William Giles, was admitted in 1885 at the age of 10, after being found insane on arraignment on a charge of arson. He was reported to be an imbecile and suffering from epilepsy. He always needed hospital care. At first, and for many years after that, there was, for practical purposes, no alternative form of care for him than Broadmoor. And during more recent years, when there might have been, it was thought that transfer would have been unkind to him." Once inside, privilege counted for little. Criminal insanity offered no private rooms, no guaranteed indulgences, and no polite separation from those deemed less respectable. And yet equality was never absolute. Some better educated or well-connected patients did receive small informal advantages, possibly lighter duties like clerical work, and some may receive a small extra monetary allowance that they may use to buy themselves a treat of some sort. But all in all, the patients ate the same food and laboured alongside one another. In Broadmoor's ordered world, hierarchy was meant to dissolve at the gates. What remained was an aspiration, uneasy, imperfect, toward equality, if only in madness. It was this mixture that made Broadmoor different. It wasn't a dumping ground for society's margins, but one of the few places where status mattered less than the verdict of the court. Respectability provided no shield. Once declared criminally insane, even the most upright Victorian could find themselves locked behind the same walls as those they had spent a lifetime judging. The crimes that led to Broadmoor were, more often than not, deeply personal Around a quarter of the males and as many as 40% of the women had committed murder. Many others had attempted to kill. Violence was frequently directed inward towards families, spouses, children, or close acquaintances, those nearest and therefore most vulnerable. These patients formed the majority of those held under what was known as the pleasure sentence. Men and women found not guilty by reason of insanity, yet considered far too dangerous to be released back into society. The wording was polite, the reality was permanent confinement. Alongside the killers were smaller but telling groups of other offenders. They were arsonists and sexual offenders whose crimes stirred deep moral panic. And there were cases that troubled Victorian sensibilities as much as they challenged the criminal law. Among them were patients confined for the alarming offence of masturbation, an activity which Victorian medical theory regarded as a direct route to insanity, moral collapse, and presumably the end of civilization as they knew it. Such cases tell us as much about the fears of the age as they do about the patients themselves. Taken together, Broadmoor's population reflected the full spectrum of Victorian anxieties: genuine danger, misunderstood illness, moral obsession, and evolving medical theory. Many of the diagnoses applied at the time remain recognizable today: mania, melancholia, dementia, though their meanings and treatments have changed dramatically. Broadmoor was a mirror. It reflected not only the extremes of criminal insanity, but also the beliefs, prejudices, and scientific certainties of the society that built it. A place where madness was feared, studied, confined, and occasionally greatly misunderstood. Male patients, considered the most violent, were housed at the rear of Broadmoor in blocks designed with security as a priority. They were the most tightly controlled parts of the hospital. Unlike the wards along the sun front, where patients could look out across the trees, fields, and open countryside, these men were denied any such views. Their doors were still open to the outside, but the view offered little consolation. High brick walls enclosing space on all sides, with only the sky above as a reminder of the world beyond. The rooms were sparse, with a mattress on the floor, and the ward attendees walked the wards in padded uniforms. Conditions inside were broadly the same as elsewhere in Broadmoor. The same routines, the same food, the same expectations of order and behaviour. But for obvious reasons, movement was far more restricted. Freedom, such as it was, came in carefully measured doses. For these men, the day room became especially important. It offered a small escape from the bleakness of their surroundings, a place to sit, to talk, or simply to pass the time. Even within Broadmoor there were degrees of confinement. Those in the southern blocks were considered low risk and given more freedom. Block 2, in particular, earned a reputation of its own. Among patients and staff alike, it became known simply as the privileged block. Block 3 included the infirmary. Block 4, admissions ward. These two blocks also housed those patients that didn't seem to fit either of the other two categories. They were the biggest blocks, each housing 100 patients. Each block offered a mix of single rooms and dormitories, sleeping 8 patients. As the years passed, Broadmoor's doctors began to notice a pattern. Patients who had rooms of their own tended to fare better than those packed into shared dormitories. Quiet, it seemed, was something more therapeutic than company. Slowly and deliberately, the long dorms were phased out and replaced with small single rooms, each containing little more than a bed and a desk. Depending on the patient and how much trust they inspired, a few personal belongings might be allowed. Nothing breakable, nothing sharp. Sentimentality was permitted only under supervision. Comfort, however, remained a secondary concern. There was no heating until the late 19th century and no lighting allowed in the rooms at all. Nights were long, winters were unforgiving. Broadmoor was, quite literally, cold and dark. an institution firmly committed to the belief that character, if not warmth, could be built through endurance. Life at Broadmoor followed a strict and predictable rhythm. The day began early, around 6 or 7 in the morning, with prayers in the chapel, whether patients felt spiritually inclined or merely awake enough to stand. It ended at 7 in the evening, by which point enthusiasm for self-improvement was usually running low. Between those hours the day was carefully structured. Meals and short periods of leisure broke things up. But most waking hours were devoted to work. Idleness, Victorian doctors believed, was really helpful and often dangerous. The range of trades carried out at Broadmoor was impressively broad. Patients cleaned wards, worked the farm, made shoes, sewed clothing, cooked, laundered, and maintained the buildings themselves. The asylum functioned almost as a small, self-contained town, one run largely by the people confined within it. The arts, however, were also strongly encouraged. Music, painting, writing, and theatre all had their place, and performances were often attended not only by staff and patients, but by members of the local community. Broadmoor, for an evening at least, could feel almost sociable. Visits from family and friends were permitted too, though carefully controlled. Affection was encouraged, but no one was allowed to forget where they were. At any one time, around 100 employees were responsible for watching over Broadmoor's growing population of patients, with Maya and Orange at the helm and a junior doctor taken on as extra help. They too came from a wide mix of backgrounds: former soldiers, ex-prison guards, labourers and working-class tradesmen were all taken on. The staff reflected Victorian society almost as closely as the patients did, just with keys instead of case files. Specialist training was minimal in truth. Little experience was expected because very few people had any. Broadmoor was a new kind of institution and there was no clear rule book of how to run it. Staff learned on the job, relying on discipline, routine and common sense, qualities valued at least as highly as medical knowledge. It was not an easy post. The work was demanding, the hours long, and the risks ever present. But for many it offered steady employment, a roof over their heads and a sense of purpose, even if that purpose involved order in one of the most unusual workplaces in Victorian Britain. One of the main qualities expected of anyone working at Broadmoor was patience and kindness. These were not empty ideals. Both Dr. John Meyer and Dr. William Orange actively looked for these traits when appointing staff, although it was said Meyer often lost his patient staff and some colleagues. In a place like Broadmoor, they believed calm and restraint mattered far more than force. They were inevitably the occasional bad apples, but by most accounts they were rare. Despite the dangers of the work, physical restraint was avoided whenever possible. It was used only in the most extreme situations, usually when a patient posed an immediate threat and staff were under attack, which it must be said did happen. Even then the rules were strict. Use of a straitjacket could only be authorised by the chief medical officer, first Mayor and later Orange. No one else had that power. Of the two men, William Orange left the deeper mark on Broadmoor. He was widely respected by staff and remembered fondly by former patients. Under his leadership, the hospital moved further away from punishment and closer to care. Many believed he helped change Broadmoor's direction, not by softening its security, but by insisting that even the most troubled patients deserved to be treated with dignity. After Dr. William Orange, his successor Dr. David Nicholson continued to challenge the law's narrow definition of insanity. Like Orange, he believed madness could take many forms and that someone could be mentally ill while still knowing their actions were wrong. Before becoming Deputy Medical Superintendent of Broadmoor in 1876, Nicholson had worked in prisons where he developed a strong interest in the link between crime and mental illness. He saw Broadmoor as a chance to study criminal lunacy in order to prevent it, not just contain it.
Both Nicholson and Orange believed that patients detained at the Queen's pleasure were not truly to blame for their crimes. Crime, they argued, was shaped by both nature and nurture, and by society's failure to intervene early. Their shared goal was prevention, stopping mental illness from becoming criminal in the first place. In 1895, Broadmoor entered a new phase under a new superintendent, Richard Brain. Unlike his predecessors, Brain had not risen through the ranks at Broadmoor. He came instead from the prison service, and he brought that background with him. Where Meyer and Orange had emphasised patience and medical judgment, Brain placed equal measure on discipline. To him, discipline, rehabilitation, and care were not opposites, they were partners. Under Brain's leadership, order tightened, routines became sharper, expectations clearer, and boundaries firmly enforced. The effect was immediate. Escape attempts declined, incidents reduced, and somewhat unexpectedly, the hospital began to flourish. Brain also understood appearances. Broadmoor underwent something of a makeover, fresh paint, improved upkeep, and an air of renewed confidence. It did not change the walls, but it changed how life inside them felt. Broadmoor was still Broadmoor, but it now looked and ran like a place that believed it was working. Brain's influence helped set the tone for Broadmoor as it entered the 20th century. Over time, the hospital became more secure, more bureaucratic, more closely aligned with the state and prison system. Broadmoor's direction changed not once but in stages. As psychiatry advanced, Broadmoor absorbed new ideas, some progressive, some later viewed as misguided. The balance between care and control continued to shift, depending on public fear, public pressure, and high-profile cases. And Broadmoor, although more modern, still stands much as it had begun, high on the Berkshire ridge, solid and imposing. Thank you for watching, or even just listening.